Asterisk that Tuesday afternoon, the House Judiciary Committee hearing room was packed to capacity. Reporters, staffers, and onlookers filled every seat, each one sensing that something major was about to happen. At the witness table sat Stephen Miller, former senior advisor to Donald Trump and a key architect of several highly controversial immigration policies. His jaw was clenched tight as he scanned the room like a hawk surveying its domain. Asterisk directly across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett from Texas adjusted her microphone. Her posture remained composed, yet her expression revealed unmistakable resolve. Over the next half hour, Miller would cut her off 6 separate times, with each interruption growing sharper than the one before. Asterisk yet it was Crockett's 7th statement, delivered with precision and calm, that finally silenced him entirely and changed the entire tone of the hearing. Within minutes, their exchange exploded online, racking up millions of views and igniting a nationwide conversation about respect, authority, and who actually controls political discourse in Washington. Asterisk before we dive into this extraordinary confrontation that gripped the country, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our in-depth coverage of defining political moments. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from engaged citizens across the nation who care deeply about truth and accountability. Asterisk to grasp why this encounter became so explosive, you first need to understand who these two individuals are and why their collision felt almost predestined the moment Miller sat down. At just 38, Stephen Miller had built his entire career as the uncompromising voice of hardline immigration enforcement. Serving as Trump's senior advisor and primary speechwriter, he played a central role in crafting some of the administration's most divisive measures, including the family separation policy at the border and the travel ban aimed at several Muslim-majority countries. Asterisk in Washington circles, Miller was notorious for his combative demeanor and relentless debating tactics. He was seldom caught off guard, having faced senators, journalists, and critics using the same approach, speaking rapidly, dominating the conversation, and never conceding a point. Asterisk opposite him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman from Texas who had rapidly gained recognition as one of Congress's most incisive and fearless interrogators. At 42, she brought courtroom-honed skills and deep moral conviction to the table. As a former civil rights attorney and public defender, she knew exactly how to handle hostile witnesses, and she understood the extra effort required to make herself heard. Asterisk that perspective had been forged by her background and the community she represented. Her district encompassed parts of Dallas and surrounding suburbs, areas profoundly impacted by the very immigration policies Miller helped design. The stakes of this hearing simply could not have been higher. Asterisk the Judiciary Committee was investigating the lasting effects of Trump-era immigration measures, with particular focus on the family separation policy that ripped thousands of children from their parents at the southern border. Newly released documents showed that officials had been fully aware of the severe emotional and psychological damage it would inflict, yet proceeded anyway. Miller had been called to answer for his direct role in drafting and executing those directives. Asterisk for Miller, the hearing represented a chance to defend his reputation and the policies he still regarded as vital to national security. He arrived armed with statistics, polished talking points, and his signature combative confidence, seeing it as another platform to advance his vision of immigration reform built on deterrence and rigid enforcement. Asterisk for Crockett, however, the matter was profoundly personal. She had visited detention facilities, spoken with separated families, and seen the trauma inflicted on children with her own eyes. As a black woman in Congress, she also instantly recognized a familiar pattern, being spoken over, interrupted, or dismissed by men in positions of power. Asterisk she had dealt with men like Miller her entire career, individuals who confused aggression with authority and interruption with intelligence. Tension crackled throughout the committee room. Behind Miller sat his legal team and advisors, all dressed in dark suits with grim faces. Behind Crockett, her staff sat beside immigration advocates, some of whom had personally endured the consequences of Miller's policies. Asterisk a few wore shirts displaying photos of separated families. Major networks broke into regular programming to broadcast the hearing live, cameras capturing every nuance. Chairman Jim Jordan gavelled the session to order at 2 p.m. sharp. Maintaining decorum would prove challenging in the packed room, but members were ready. Asterisk Democrats were prepared to grill Miller on his record. Republicans were ready to shield him and pivot attention to current border issues. Yet everyone understood the most eagerly awaited clash would be between Miller and Crockett. For the first 20 minutes, the tension steadily mounted. Asterisk several Democratic members questioned Miller, but he handled each exchange predictably, evading direct answers, talking over his questioners, and falling back on rehearsed defenses. Republican members lobbed friendly questions that let him portray himself as a misunderstood patriot. No one had managed to breach his armor. Then Chairman Jordan declared, "The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Crockett, for 5 minutes." The room instantly hushed. Cameras zoomed tight. Crockett leaned into her microphone, her voice steady and assured. "Mr. Miller," she started, "thank you for appearing today. I want to begin with a simple question. Do you acknowledge that the family separation policy caused documented psychological harm to thousands of children?" Miller fired back immediately, his words fast and cutting. "Congresswoman, what I acknowledge is that the policy was necessary for border security." Before he could finish the thought, Crockett cut in. "Mr. Miller," but he spoke right over her. "The real trauma," he insisted, "comes from human traffickers exploiting children and from previous administration's policies that incentivized illegal crossings." Crockett raised her volume slightly while staying composed. "Mr. Miller, I'm asking specifically about the documented trauma." Miller interrupted again, leaning into his mic, voice escalating. "The documentation you cite comes from biased sources that deliberately ignore broader context." "Mr. Miller," Crockett said firmly, "this is my time, and I would appreciate," he broke in once more, tone unyielding. "The border crisis was the product of decades of failed policy that President Trump and I worked to correct." Murmurs swept through the gallery. "People like you," Chairman Jordan gave a tepid tap of the gavel. "The witness will allow the member to ask her questions." Miller eased back slightly, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on Crockett. She remained unflustered, flipping through her documents as if the interruptions were minor distractions. "Mr. Miller," she continued, "I hold here a memo from your own Department of Health and Human Services stating, and I quote, significant and lasting psychological damage to children would result from family separation. This is your administration's own assessment. Do you dispute it?" Miller launched into another deflection. "What I dispute is the notion that we were indifferent to children's welfare when in fact the memo clearly." Crockett attempted to proceed, but Miller barreled on. "The Obama administration built the cages. They separated families too, they just never admitted that real enforcement requires difficult choices." The audience grew restless. Several Democratic members shook their heads, even some Republicans looked uncomfortable with Miller's aggressive tone. Crockett stayed calm, taking notes while Miller delivered a lengthy monologue. When he finally paused, she jumped in quickly. "Mr. Miller, I understand you have talking points, but I'm referencing documents from your administration." Miller nearly shouted over her. "My administration. My administration saved lives. We stopped child trafficking that you seem determined to overlook." Crockett turned to the chairman. "Mr. Chairman, I'd ask that the witness be directed to let me use my time for questions." Jordan tapped the gavel weakly again. "Mr. Miller, please allow the Congresswoman to ask her questions." Miller sat back, face flushed, fingers gripping the table's edge. Cameras clicked furiously, reporters live-tweeted updates. Crockett locked eyes with him, her voice steady as iron. "Mr. Miller, I've been a civil rights attorney and a public defender. I've stood in courtrooms all across this country, and I have never," Miller cut her off again, leaning forward with a smirk. "Your courtroom experience doesn't qualify you to lecture on national security or border enforcement. Congresswoman, the reality is." This time Crockett did not interrupt or appeal to the chair. She simply leaned back, arms folded, and waited. Miller rambled on for nearly 30 seconds, voice echoing as he railed about trafficking, border policy, and alleged Democratic failures. When he finally stopped, expecting a rebuttal, Crockett remained silent. 1 beat. 2 beats. The silence grew heavy, almost physical. Everyone in the room leaned forward. Then she spoke, calm, deliberate, her words carrying undeniable weight. The chamber was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning. Every eye fixed on Jasmine Crockett as she leaned in, hands neatly folded, gaze boring into Stephen Miller with an intensity that made gallery members hold their breath. "Mr. Miller," she began, voice calm yet resonant across the room. "You have now interrupted me 6 times. 6 times you have shown this committee, the American public watching at home, and everyone present exactly who you are. Miller opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett raised one finger, and something in her expression made him freeze. You see, she went on, voice steady but gaining force, men like you have been interrupting women like me our entire lives. You interrupt because you believe your voice matters more than ours. You interrupt because you think volume equals authority. You interrupt because, deep down, you know that if you actually had to answer my questions honestly, if you had to confront the evidence of the harm you inflicted on thousands of children, your entire carefully constructed narrative would crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. The room fell deathly silent. Miller's face drained from red to ashen. His lawyer sat frozen, unsure whether to jump in. Crockett began laying document after document on the table as she continued. Let me explain what these papers actually say, Mr. Miller, since you've made normal questioning nearly impossible. This memo from your own deputy at Health and Human Services confirms that children as young as 8 months old were taken from their mothers, 8 months old. This report from your Customs and Border Protection admits there was Northwest system whatsoever in place to reunite families, none. And this email chain bearing your name shows you brushing aside psychological warnings because, and I quote, the deterrent effect outweighs other considerations. She paused, staring straight at him. Miller's knuckles went white gripping the table. His mouth moved soundlessly. Other considerations, Crockett repeated softly, voice low but razor sharp. Those other considerations were children, Mr. Miller. Babies. Toddlers. Kids who will carry that trauma for the rest of their lives. And you knew it. You all knew it. And you did it anyway. The gallery erupted, some people openly wept, others nodded vigorously. Chairman Jordan banged the gavel for order, but Crockett pressed on, voice now rising with power. What truly matters, Mr. Miller, is that you can interrupt me, talk over me, try to belittle me, but I am still here. Those children are still suffering. Those families are still broken. And you are still responsible. She leaned forward, eyes locked on his, and delivered the line that would circle the globe. You may have had the power to separate families, Mr. Miller, but you cannot separate yourself from the consequences of your actions. Interrupting me 6 times changes nothing about the fact that history has already judged you, and found you wanting. Your legacy is not strength, Mr. Miller. It is the sound of children crying for parents they were torn away from, and no amount of interruptions will ever drown that out. The room exploded. Miller's face turned ghostly pale. His mouth opened and closed, no sound emerged. For the first time in his public life, Stephen Miller was utterly speechless. His attorneys whispered frantically, but he didn't react. His stare stayed fixed on Crockett, disbelief and unease plain in his eyes. People in the gallery rose to their feet applauding. Reporters hammered their keyboards, the C-SPAN camera zoomed in tight on Miller's stunned silence. Chairman Jordan pounded the gavel, voice lost in the chaos. Several Democratic members stood and clapped, even a few Republicans looked visibly shaken. Crockett sat perfectly still, hands folded, expression serene. She had used barely 3 of her 5 minutes, but she was finished, she had said everything that needed saying. When relative quiet finally returned, Chairman Jordan asked softly, Mr. Miller, would you care to respond to the Congresswoman's remarks? Miller leaned toward his microphone. When his voice finally came, it was hoarse and unsteady, nothing like the commanding tone he'd wielded all day. I stand by the policies of the Trump administration. We were protecting America. The words landed flat, everyone heard the hollowness. Miller knew it too. The men who built his career on dominance had just been dismantled by a freshman congresswoman from Texas. Crockett's final words were quiet but definitive. Mr. Chairman, she said calmly, I yield back the balance of my time. Mr. Miller's silence speaks louder than anything else. As she yielded, a profound hush settled over the room, louder than any shouting could have been. Then something extraordinary happened. Members of the gallery began rising one by one in slow, deliberate applause that spread like a wave. Even a few Republicans on the dais shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Miller's gaze. Miller remained frozen at the witness table, his once neat notes scattered and forgotten. His team of lawyers and advisors behind him looked shell-shocked. They had prepped him for every possible attack on policy and record, but they hadn't prepared him for Jasmine Crockett turning his own interruptions into damning evidence of character and delivering a calm, surgical demolition that left no room for recovery. Asterisk the silence lingered, thick with meaning. Miller's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass and nearly knocked it over. The man who once stood confidently at the White House podium defending the indefensible now looked as if he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Asterisk Representative Ted Lieu, next in line, leaned to his microphone and said simply, "Mr. Chairman, I believe Ms. Crockett has said everything that needs to be said. I yield my time." One after another, Democratic members did the same, unprecedented, each surrendering precious questioning time against one of the Trump era's most controversial figures, because nothing they could add would carry more weight than what the room had just witnessed. Asterisk each yielded minute chipped away further at whatever composure Miller had left. By the time Chairman Jordan called recess, Miller resembled a boxer still on his feet only because he hadn't yet realized the knockout blow had already landed. Asterisk as the room emptied, he stayed seated, staring blankly at the table. His team clustered around him whispering, but he barely registered their words. In just 3 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had achieved what years of protests, media scrutiny, and criticism never could. She stripped away the self-righteous armor Miller had worn and laid bare the cruelty at the heart of his policies. Asterisk within minutes clips were racing across the internet. "Crockett destroys Miller," trended worldwide. Her devastating line, "Your legacy isn't strength, Mr. Miller. It's the sound of children crying for parents they were torn away from," was shared millions of times, turned into memes, and painted on protest signs. But inside that hearing room, only silence remained. Asterisk Stephen Miller, the architect of family separation, a man who had never met a microphone he couldn't command, sat defeated while Jasmine Crockett calmly gathered her papers and walked out, head high. The fallout from Crockett's exchange rippled swiftly through Washington and the country. Asterisk within an hour the clip surpassed 10 million views across platforms. Major networks broke into programming to replay the moment. Commentators on both sides agreed something historic had occurred. On CNN, Anderson Cooper opened his show with the full 3-minute exchange uninterrupted, then said, "In 20 years covering politics, I have never seen anything quite like what we just witnessed." The famously unflappable Stephen Miller, known for never backing down, was rendered speechless by Representative Crockett's composed, devastating response. Asterisk even conservative outlets struggled to spin it. On Fox News, Tucker Carlson conceded, "Miller walked into a trap today. He should have just let her ask the questions." Laura Ingraham tried redirecting to current border issues, but guests kept circling back to the viral moment. On MSNBC, Joy Reid was jubilant, "This is what happens when you try to bulldoze a black woman who showed up with receipts." Jasmine Crockett didn't just shut Stephen Miller down, she exposed the fragility of bullies who confuse interruption with intellect. Asterisk the political world reacted fast. Former President Obama tweeted, "Representative Jasmine Crockett today showed us what grace under pressure looks like." More importantly, she reminded us that the voices of those harmed by cruel policies will not be silenced. President Biden issued a White House statement. Today's hearing underscored the lasting wounds inflicted by the previous administration's family separation policy. Representative Crockett's powerful words remind us why such cruelty must never be repeated. Asterisk Donald Trump, predictably, rushed to Truth Social. Stephen Miller was ambushed by a radical left Democrat who knows nothing about border security. He was fighting for America while she grandstanded for the cameras. Witch hunt. Yet even Trump's defense felt muted compared to his usual fire. More telling was the silence from Miller's typical allies. Ted Cruz claimed he didn't watch the hearing. "I was working on legislation." Marco Rubio told reporters, "Everyone needs to lower the temperature and focus on solutions." Their restraint spoke volumes. Asterisk Crockett's office was flooded with support. Her social following surged by over 500,000 in a single day. Interview requests poured in, but she accepted almost none, appearing only once, on PBS NewsHour, where she kept the focus on policy substance rather than the viral clash. "This isn't about me versus Stephen Miller," she told Amna Nawaz. "It's about accountability for policies that deliberately harmed thousands of children. The American people deserve truth, not theater, and the truth is those policies were intentionally cruel." Asterisk Miller's team scrambled into damage control mode, releasing a statement claiming he had been ambushed and that Crockett was exploiting national security for political points. It landed as defensive and unconvincing. Miller himself stayed unusually quiet, even canceling a scheduled Hannity appearance. Behind the scenes, Republican frustration mounted. One anonymous GOP judiciary member told Politico, "He made us all look bad." You can't just talk over people in a hearing. Crockett handled him perfectly, he walked right into it. Immigration advocacy groups seized the moment. Crockett's seventh statement became a new rallying cry, printed on t-shirts, protest signs, and hashtags. Families who had lived the policy began sharing their stories again, empowered by finally seeing someone hold Miller accountable in public. Legal experts noted that the documents Crockett entered into the record, many previously underreported, clearly showed the administration knew the psychological harm it would cause and proceeded anyway. Constitutional scholar Lawrence Tribe called her approach brilliant from a legal standpoint. She didn't just humiliate Miller publicly, she placed irrefutable evidence into the congressional record. His inability to rebut it functions as tacit admission and will matter in court. Culturally, the exchange became a masterclass in power dynamics, interruption, and respect. Women's organizations hailed it as textbook mansplaining and an ideal model of pushback. #LethiaSpeak trended as thousands of women shared their own stories of being cut off in professional settings. Corporate DEI trainings began using the clip. NYU Law's Dr. Kenji Yoshino explained, Miller's interruptions weren't mere rudeness, they were an attempt to undermine a congresswoman's legitimate authority. Crockett's response should be required viewing for anyone studying power. Within a week the political fallout was clear. Miller's stature in conservative circles took a major hit. Candidates quietly distanced themselves from his endorsement, speaking fees dried up. More importantly, family separation, fading from headlines, roared back into national focus. The Biden administration announced renewed reunification efforts. Congress began debating reparations and safeguards against future separations. Crockett used her newfound platform judiciously, introducing the Family Protection Act banning separation except in verified cases of abuse or trafficking. The bill drew bipartisan co-sponsors eager to move past the Trump-era stain. She also began mentoring young women of color entering public life. At a Houston leadership conference she told them that hearing wasn't just about me and Stephen Miller. It was about every woman ever told to sit down, wait her turn, or let the men talk. You never have to accept that. You deserve to be heard, respected, and empowered to hold power accountable. The exchange triggered fresh scrutiny of the Trump immigration record. New FOIA requests and whistleblowers surfaced more details. 3 months later the DHS Inspector General report corroborated Crockett's evidence. Officials including Miller had been repeatedly warned yet treated trauma as part of the deterrent. Miller's attempted Wall Street Journal comeback op-ed was widely panned as defensive and evasive. A year on, the moment still resonated. A documentary on U.S. immigration policy featured Crockett and affected families. Miller declined to participate, and won multiple awards. Political science classes used it as a case study in effective oversight. Preparation, composure, and moral clarity defeating aggression, Professor Jennifer Lawless called it. In subsequent hearings, witnesses trying Miller-style interruptions were quickly shut down with the phrase, "We're not doing Miller interruptions here." Women across industries began describing their own Crockett moments. Pulling a Crockett entered the lexicon, calmly turning an opponent's hostility against them. For Miller the reputational damage proved lasting. His influence never fully recovered, appearances were relegated to friendly podcasts and fringe events. Legal consequences continued, lawsuits from separated families cited the hearing transcripts, and one federal judge explicitly referenced Crockett's presentation in awarding damages, writing, as Representative Crockett powerfully demonstrated, the cruelty was not accidental, it was deliberate. 2 years later Crockett published the bestseller Uninterrupted, Speaking Truth to Power in America. The chapter on the Miller exchange became the most discussed. In it she wrote, "That moment wasn't scripted. I had my questions and my documents ready. But when Stephen Miller interrupted me the 6th time, it became crystal clear, his interruptions weren't just disrespect toward me, they mirrored exactly how his policies had interrupted the lives of thousands of families. When I finally spoke, I spoke for every child crying themselves to sleep in a cage wondering where their parents were. Men like him never understand, you can interrupt our words, but you cannot interrupt our truth." 3 years after the hearing, Crockett's line, "Your legacy isn't strength, it's the sound of children crying," remained one of the most quoted statements in modern U.S. political history. Crockett herself had become a leading Democratic voice, yet stayed focused on policy, passing multiple immigration and child welfare bills while always saying, "Every bill I write, I think of those children. They deserve better. We all do." Miller largely withdrew from public view. The image of him silenced before Crockett became the defining picture of his career. The broader lesson for American democracy endured: preparation, truth, and moral clarity can still defeat aggression and cruelty. In an era dominated by noise and theater, Jasmine Crockett proved that substance and integrity still win. Her calm, resolute response became the blueprint for holding power to account. The story of how she turned 6 interruptions into her opponent's undoing has become more than a viral clip. It is now a masterclass in leadership. Let bad behavior expose character, then answer with unflinching truth. The 7 pivotal statements that shifted everything were: her initial question on documented trauma, her attempts to cite specific memos, her plea for basic respect of her time, her presentation of HHS documents, her reference to her courtroom background, her silent patience during the 6th interruption, and finally the line that ended his credibility forever. For anyone facing their own Stephen Miller, someone who mistakes volume for logic, Crockett's example remains the roadmap: never match aggression with aggression. Let their conduct reveal who they are, then respond with calm, informed, moral truth. The ripples continue across politics and culture. Young professionals study the exchange for handling disrespect. Law schools teach it as witness control. Political scientists cite it as a turning point in congressional oversight. Most importantly, the families who lived the policy finally heard someone in power say plainly that what happened to them was wrong, deliberate, and inhumane. Crockett didn't just win a viral moment. She gave voice to the voiceless, dignity to the dehumanized, and hope to the forgotten. In a time when noise often drowns truth, her triumph reminds us that composure and preparation still prevail, that bullies, no matter how loud, collapse beneath the weight of unwavering moral clarity. As America continues reckoning with the legacy of family separation and works toward justice, the lesson from that day remains unmistakable: those who interrupt to evade accountability will eventually be interrupted, permanently, by the truth. And when that truth finally speaks, all their noise falls silent. If this deep dive moved or informed you, please subscribe and tap the bell. Your support lets us keep delivering thoughtful analysis of the moments that shape our democracy. Share this with anyone who believes in truth and accountability. Let us know in the comments what other pivotal moments we should cover next. Remember, in the fight for truth and justice, every voice matters. The real question is whether we will use ours as powerfully as Jasmine Crockett did that day. The choice is ours. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never let anyone interrupt your truth.